First question we had for you was about affordable housing and high rises, the legacy of it, and if you think developers have any obligation to create affordable housing.
Yeah, it's a good question actually. I feel that developers are there to make money, so I think it's really a collaboration with the government. And if the government wants affordable housing and they may be able to do a quid pro quo with the developers as far as maybe having a higher building, put some affordable housing in a super tall building, but nevertheless still give them the opportunity of making some funds out of the other parts of the building. So it's really a collaboration component with the government.
Mm-hmm.
That's my personal view.
Right. It seems like there's a lot of talk about making mixed income communities.
Yes.
Do you think there's any value to that inherently?
I think it's always difficult when you have, some people that could afford certain things, cars in the car park or, bicycles in the car park. Sometimes the interdependency is a bit difficult. That's, again, my personal view, it's not the company's view.
We've been talking a lot about vertical communities at this conference and previous ones. How would you define a vertical community as opposed to just disparate uses stacked one on top of the other?
It's actually very difficult to get it right. A vertical community really is about independence and connectivity. So if you start to consider that you've got a whole bunch of different asset classes, and what I mean by that is hotels and high-end shopping, and you've also got high-end food and beverage, and you've got, say, a 3-star hotel, the interdependency is not right. So if you get the same groups of people that are interdependent, let me give you an example. There's a very clear interdependency, can be small as far as these circles go, or it can be quite large depending on the community that you have within.
And the circles are?
And the circles are, say, grade A office building, and you have very good grade A tenants, and you have very high level sort of retailing, and you also have very good food and beverage in the building, as well as a 5-star hotel. Then all of a sudden the 5-star hotel can cater to the occupiers that people are visiting, and they go down to a restaurant or they go down to the hotel restaurants. So there's a great deal more in the dependency amongst each of those different uses. But if you have it wrong, it actually works against itself. That vertical community doesn't work that well.
How does it work against itself?
Well, if you get it wrong, it could be that each one of them is very much isolated within their own boundaries, and the vertical community is all about having areas where they all congregate, become part of each other. Do you see what I mean? It could become essentially siloed otherwise.
Does that extend to public use beyond just the tenants of the building?
Definitely, because these buildings are not necessarily a castle in the sand. They are, people have to come in and go. Walkability is a big factor of it. It could be some entertainment areas within the retail. It could be a cinema, could be theatres, obviously food and beverage. So definitely having that community sense.
Are there projects you're involved with at the moment that you think are a good example of that kind of thinking?
Yeah, we actually are involved in about 16 super tall buildings in China at the moment, and some of them work extremely well, and others probably need a little bit more thought and consideration between the designers, between the developers, the owners ultimately. But the ones that work, to answer the question, there's a couple of them that seem to be able to work really well. Shanghai Tower is something that we've been involved with, and I think that they're getting that right. They're getting the covenants with the tenants, and they're getting the retail podiums extremely well organised, and also the office tower. So I think the current observation is that it's going to work extremely well. They've also got 9 sky towers and sky lobbies, which are the transitional floors. In the past they've been bland. You just go onto a floor, go onto another rise of a lift, and it doesn't tend to work well. But now they've got food and beverage in those sky lobbies, so all of a sudden they become more of a community sense. They're starting to talk about bars and big bookstores in some of these lobbies. So that's where the vertical community can really get it right.
Creating a destination as opposed to an interstitial space.
Correct. And it used to be the retail area at the podium level that was expected to do that, but generally they tended to be a whole bunch of different retailers and food and beverage places without really destination type shopping.
how does that change the character of the building when you spread out what used to be in the podium throughout the height of the building?
I think with the super tall, you've got to start doing that. I'll give you an example. Vertical transportation is probably the most difficult thing in a super tall building.
Lifts, elevators.
The lifts and elevators. So if everybody at lunchtime, at 12 o'clock, 12:30, 1 o'clock, and some of these buildings can house 20 and 30,000 people, if they all go down to the lobby area at once, everything gets jammed. And that's happened time and time again because most of the prior buildings, these super talls, have been mainly office buildings. But nowadays they've got these sky lobbies, and Shanghai Tower having 9 of them, they can actually create within a section of the building that they only go down to that part to have their food and beverage. So it makes it a little bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. And it could make a feeling of several communities throughout.
Exactly. And they could be themed. It could even be that a group, a very large occupier may take up a whole section, and that actually sky lobby could be themed for them, personally.
What do you see as the potential for green walls in buildings or other ways of incorporating nature into tall building design?
I see a lot of green walls. I've seen it in New York. I was there a couple of weeks ago. Mumbai, the most expensive house in the world in Mumbai, and he's got green walls on the outside. The big problem with green walls is getting the water, to that area, and the drainage from that water. And sometimes it doesn't work very well because the sun doesn't hit it necessarily correctly. It's got to be well planned. So my observation is that you can actually get this right, but you have to you have to make sure that you plan it correctly and not just put up a green wall. I've seen so many that are just not working.
Right. I guess if you just put up a green wall for green wall's sake, that makes it like a fad. If you integrate it into the systems
It's
of the building, it can actually probably help.
I'll give you
with
an
drainage, for example.
Yeah, well, 6 Battery Road in Singapore, you go into the foyer there and the entire wall is green and all different plants, etc. And that works extremely well. You can actually see the water, at different times feeding the plants, etc. But that works well, but most of the time it seems to, have sections that fail and they get brown.
Can you elaborate on how better to integrate nature or green walls specifically into tall buildings?
I think you need to have natural light. Sometimes they put it in foyers and then the light is not very good, so you tend to have problems. So you need to have natural light. I also feel that the water system needs to be very effective. Sprinklers rather than just dripping water into, a pot. And then the drainage is fundamental. So I've seen some green walls that are starting to create problems with lifting at the back of the green wall, because the water seeps into the back of the tiles, and then the tiles start to fall off and the wall comes apart. But it has to be completely integrated, completely waterproofed, and natural light.
Is sprawl becoming a huge problem in China, or has it already been? What should be done about sprawl?
I think urbanisation has caused a lot of this. I read the other day that there's a 7th ring road in Beijing about to start.
Like 1,000 kilometers or something.
1,000 kilometres, yeah.
Circumference, yeah.
It's and they started with 1 ring road. Now they're up to 7 potentially. I think sprawl is a big problem. It can be overcome by transport hubs. If you can get that transport to be very effective. An example of very effective cities are Hong Kong and Singapore, because they can actually but they're smaller type cities. When you start talking about a sprawl of 50, 60 kilometres away from the CBD, then you really have to consider how to get the cars, because most people will drive, how to get the cars to a transport hub, and then from there getting people in. So you're talking about 30-odd million people in a place like Beijing, and how do you move those people around very effectively when you've got such a sprawl? It's a fine line. It really is a fine line. You've got to create the opportunity for people to do the urbanisation piece, and that's why I think maybe vertical cities are an answer to it, because you don't have to spread people so far out. Again, I refer to Hong Kong. I live in Hong Kong, and it's one of those cities that seems to get it right with the vertical, and it's also on ground level. It works extremely well. But when you start to talk about Beijing and go to the suburbs, it starts to get so ineffective, and it does cost. In fact, that talk that we were discussing earlier with Anthony, he was looking at distances between travel, etc.,
Right.
and it's very inefficient. Hours to get into work, big traffic jams if they're coming in by cars. So the transport is very needed, and it needs to be completely well thought out with the town planners.
Sure. So from your perspective on the ground, then the opportunities are in transit-oriented developments, or what sort of trends are you engaged in that sort of react to that?
I think that's right. I think that what we need to do is have transportational hubs and vertical communities within those transportational hubs or close to them, and so it's not a big distance for people to walk to, even rather than even having cars.
Is that a hot development market now, or is that more aspirational?
I think it's being considered a lot, Chris. My observation of this is that we had several talks over the last couple of days, and they all talking about having a bus and train type hub, and people could actually get to that hub and then easily go into a city. And there's a lot of discussion. San Francisco is an example of that. Just there was a talk yesterday on the Salesforce building in San Francisco, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Can vertical communities ever really be integrated, or will they always sort of lack something that you only get from being on the street level?
I personally think it can be integrated. Again, we come back to this idea of getting the right group of people and the right asset classes together. The groups that can actually interact a lot more, and I think it can work. It sometimes comes down to money. When you build a big building and you need to get it leased up quickly, you may not necessarily hold to your principles and your vision, because they have to get the money in, and that's when it starts to get messy. But if you can hold it and make sure that you get that strategy right with the developer, with the owner, with the occupiers, with the retail occupiers, then it can actually work extremely well for everybody's benefit.
You talk about integrating different asset classes. Where do you see the biggest challenge if we really do realize this dense vertical city that's integrated throughout all walks of life? How does that really happen, or do we end up pushing people out further away, and the dense urban core is still only for some people?
Yeah, and that's the biggest problem. I think you've hit it on the head. I think that some of these very large buildings are going to apply to the more wealthier families.
Historically, that's been usually the case.
Historically, and if they can again work with government and possibly give them the opportunity of having affordable housing within these super talls, give a bit of a pro quo opportunity for the developer to make some money in some other aspect of the property, they probably can get it right. But it's probably at that first part at the moment, where more wealthier people are buying $2-3 million US type apartments, and they're the ones that are in these vertical cities.